The humid Georgia air hung heavy, thick with the scent of freshly cut lawns and simmering resentment. John Cooper, an FBI agent for 7 years, stood on his porch, a glass of lemonade sweating in his hand. He'd just finished mowing the front yard, a small act of normalcy in a life often defined by clandestine operations and the pursuit of justice. He enjoyed the quiet moments, the feeling of being just John, a homeowner in a quiet suburban neighborhood. But that tranquility was about to be shattered. A black SUV, ridiculously oversized for the narrow street, lumbered to a halt at the curb. 2 figures emerged, clad in what appeared to be ill-fitting, quasi-military uniforms. Patches, poorly sewn, proclaimed them as Harmony Oaks HOA security, a claim John knew to be utter fabrication. He recognized the predatory glint in their eyes, the carefully cultivated air of authority designed to intimidate. He'd heard whispers about them in the local black community, tales of harassment and trumped-up fines dished out with unsettling regularity. This wasn't about enforcing lawn maintenance rules, it was about something far more insidious. John Cooper, one of the figures barked, his voice grating and overly aggressive. He puffed out his chest, a pathetic attempt at appearing imposing. "You're in violation of several HOA regulations. We're here to take you into custody." John took a slow sip of his lemonade, his gaze unwavering. "Custody? For what, exactly? Leaving my trash cans out too long? Letting the grass grow an inch too high?" The man, a skinny fellow with a receding hairline and a disturbingly eager expression, fumbled with a cheap-looking plastic clipboard. "Multiple infractions. Noise complaints, unapproved landscaping, and, general, unsightliness." John chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that clearly unsettled the 2 men. "Unsightliness? Is that even in the HOA guidelines? Last time I checked, my property taxes were paid and my lawn was immaculate." He knew exactly what was happening. He'd been briefed on the activities of Mary Hartdale and her band of racist con artists. They preyed on black homeowners, using the veneer of HOA authority to harass, intimidate, and ultimately drive them out of the neighborhood. It was a land grab disguised as civic responsibility. He subtly reached into his pocket, his fingers dancing across the familiar texture of his cell phone. He'd already programmed a speed dial to the local police precinct, a precaution he'd taken as soon as he'd heard the whispers begin to swirl. He just needed to keep them talking, to stall for time. "Gentlemen, I'm afraid you're mistaken. I'm quite familiar with the HOA regulations, and I assure you, I'm in full compliance. Perhaps you have the wrong address." The second man, a bulky figure with a perpetually sour expression, stepped forward. "Don't play coy with us, Cooper. We know who you are. We know what you do. And we know you think you're above the law." That was all the confirmation John needed. They knew he was an FBI agent. This wasn't just random harassment, it was targeted. Before John could formulate a response, another vehicle, a gleaming white Lexus, pulled up behind the SUV. From it emerged 3 women, all blonde, all impeccably dressed, and all radiating an unnerving air of condescension. The leader, John recognized instantly from the briefings, was Mary Hartdale. Her icy blue eyes scanned him with undisguised disdain, and a tight, predatory smile played on her lips. "Well, well, well," she purred, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Mr. Cooper. We've been expecting you to cause trouble. I am Mary Hartdale and this is the Harmony Oaks Homeowners Association and you are not in compliance without rules and will be coming with us." She stepped forward, her high heels clicking on the pavement. "Mr. Cooper, I'm afraid these gentlemen are quite correct. You are in flagrant violation of several HOA covenants. We've given you ample warning. Now, you're coming with us." "Coming with you where, exactly?" John asked, maintaining his composure. "Since when does the HOA have the authority to arrest people?" "We have the authority to enforce our regulations," Mary snapped, her composure momentarily cracking. And your violations are so egregious, we have the right to take you in for questioning, and possible civil penalties with jail time. One of the other blonde women, a younger, vapid-looking individual with an abundance of lip gloss, chimed in. It's for the good of the community, Mr. Cooper. We can't have people like you undermining the property values. The third woman, older and more hardened-looking, simply stared at John with a silent, malevolent glare. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that suggested she was the muscle of the operation. John sighed inwardly. This was even more absurd than he'd anticipated. They were doubling down on their charade, attempting to use their sheer audacity to overwhelm him. He glanced at his phone, praying for the police to arrive. He needed to buy more time. Ms. Hartdale, he said, his voice calm and measured. I understand your concerns, but I assure you, I'm not in violation of any HOA regulations. Perhaps we could discuss this like reasonable adults, review the specific covenants you believe I've violated, and come to a mutually agreeable solution. Mary laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed in the afternoon air. Reasonable? Mr. Cooper, you've been given every opportunity to be reasonable. You've chosen to ignore our warnings, to flout our authority. Now, you'll face the consequences. She gestured towards the two men in their ridiculous uniforms. Take him into custody. The men, emboldened by Mary's presence, lunged forward, their hands outstretched. John knew he couldn't let them touch him. It would be a pretext for further escalation, an opportunity to claim he resisted arrest, to inflict further humiliation. He braced himself, ready to defend his home and his dignity. John sidestepped the first man, his movements fluid and precise, honed by years of training. The man stumbled, his momentum carrying him forward, almost tripping over his own feet. The second man, slower and more lumbering, reached for John's arm. John smoothly deflected the grip, using the man's own weight against him, sending him off balance. I suggest you think very carefully about what you're doing, John said, his voice low and dangerous. You're trespassing on private property, impersonating law enforcement officials, and attempting to unlawfully detain me. These are serious crimes. Mary Hartdale's face contorted with rage. Don't listen to him. He's trying to intimidate you. He thinks he's above the law because he works for the FBI. That admission, blurted out in frustration, was all the confirmation the men needed. They surged forward again, their movements more aggressive, more determined. John knew he couldn't avoid a physical confrontation any longer. He had to defend himself, but he also had to be careful not to escalate the situation unnecessarily. He couldn't afford to give them any ammunition to use against him. He parried their blows, dodging and weaving, using his superior agility to avoid their clumsy attempts to grab him. He didn't strike back, focusing solely on defense, on protecting himself from harm. He was acutely aware of the neighbors watching from their windows, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. He didn't want to give them a spectacle, to confirm their worst prejudices. He glanced at his phone again. Still no sign of the police. He was running out of time. He needed to find a way to de-escalate the situation, to stall for a few more minutes. Ms. Hartdale, he said, his voice regaining its composure. I understand you're frustrated, but this is going nowhere. I'm not going to allow you to unlawfully detain me. Why don't we just wait for the police to arrive, and let them sort this out? Mary's eyes narrowed. You think the police are going to help you? They're on our side, Cooper. They know what you people are like. John suppressed a sigh. He knew this was going to be a long day. He maintained his position, keeping the two men at bay, his mind racing, searching for a solution. The blonde brigade stood behind their henchmen, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. They were so confident in their power, so convinced of their invincibility. They truly believed they could get away with anything. He had to prove them wrong. The police were on their way, only minutes away. He just had to hold on, to maintain his composure, to prevent the situation from spiraling out of control. He just had to wait. He had to stall. The sound of sirens, faint at first, grew steadily louder, slicing through the tense atmosphere like a knife. Relief washed over John as he saw the flashing lights of 2 police cruisers turn onto his street. The 2 men in their fake security uniforms froze, their faces etched with uncertainty. Mary Hartdale's carefully constructed facade of confidence began to crumble. "What's going on here?" a deep voice boomed as 2 officers, their faces grim, emerged from the lead cruiser. One of them, a young black woman, immediately recognized John. She'd met him at a community outreach event a few months prior. The other, a seasoned veteran with a no-nonsense demeanor, surveyed the scene with a practiced eye. "Officers, this man is in violation of several HOA regulations," Mary Hartdale declared, her voice regaining a semblance of authority. "We were attempting to take him into custody when he resisted arrest." The black female officer, Officer Davis, raised an eyebrow. "HOA regulations? Take him into custody? I wasn't aware the Harmony Oaks HOA had the power of arrest." She already knew what was going on. She had heard the complaints. "We have the authority to enforce our covenants," Mary insisted, her voice growing shrill. "This man is a menace to the community." The veteran officer, Officer Miller, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification. And I'd like to know exactly what violations Mr. Cooper is alleged to have committed." Mary fumbled in her purse, producing a laminated card that identified her as the president of the Harmony Oaks HOA. Officer Miller examined it closely, his expression unreadable. "And these gentlemen?" he asked, gesturing towards the 2 men in their ridiculous uniforms. "There are security personnel," Mary replied, her voice wavering slightly. Officer Miller turned to the men. "Identification, please." The men exchanged nervous glances. The first man stammered, "We don't have it on us right now." Officer Miller's face hardened, "That's not going to work here. Let me see some identification, or you will be arrested for impersonating an officer." The second man pulled out a driver's license, his hands shaking. Officer Miller took it, scrutinizing it carefully. Officer Davis approached John. "Mr. Cooper, are you all right?" she asked, her voice low. "I'm fine, Officer Davis," John replied. "But I believe these individuals are attempting to harass and intimidate me under the guise of enforcing HOA regulations. I suspect it's racially motivated." Officer Davis nodded grimly. "We've heard some concerning reports about the Harmony Oaks HOA. We'll get to the bottom of this." Officer Miller, after examining the driver's license, turned back to Mary Hartdale. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you and your associates to step aside. We need to ask Mr. Cooper some questions." Mary protested, "But he's the one who's violating the law." Officer Miller ignored her protests and directed his attention to John. "Mr. Cooper, can you tell us what happened here?" John calmly recounted the events of the past hour, detailing the arrival of the fake security personnel, their accusations of HOA violations, Mary Hartdale's threats, and the attempted unlawful detention. He emphasized the racially charged nature of the harassment, highlighting the HOA's history of targeting black homeowners. As John spoke, Officer Davis discreetly ran a background check on Mary Hartdale and the 2 men. The results came back quickly. Mary Hartdale had a long history of civil complaints related to harassment and discrimination. The 2 men had prior arrests for petty theft and assault. The information confirmed their suspicions. Officer Miller turned to Mary Hartdale, his voice stern. "Ma'am, I'm placing you under arrest for harassment, attempted unlawful detention, and impersonating a police officer. These 2 men are under arrest for the same charges." Mary's face paled. "You can't do this. I'm the president of the HOA. That doesn't give you the right to harass and intimidate people," Officer Miller retorted, slapping handcuffs on her wrists. The other officers moved to arrest the 2 men, who who offered no resistance. The two blonde women who had come with Mary looked on in horror, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. They realized that their carefully constructed world, built on prejudice and intimidation, was crumbling around them. Officer Davis approached them. "Ladies, I'm going to need your names and addresses. We may need to speak with you later as witnesses." The women, their voices trembling, complied. They were clearly out of their depth, unprepared for the consequences of their actions. As Mary Hartdale and her accomplices were led away in handcuffs, a small crowd of neighbors gathered, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and vindication. They had witnessed the Harmony Oaks HOA's reign of terror firsthand, and they were finally seeing justice served. The arrest of Mary Hartdale and her cronies sent shockwaves through the Harmony Oaks community. The reign of terror that had plagued black homeowners for so long was finally over. The remaining members of the HOA, realizing the extent of Mary's illegal activities, quickly distanced themselves from her and pledged to reform the organization. John Cooper, initially targeted for his race and profession, became a symbol of resilience and resistance. He worked closely with the police and community leaders to ensure that the Harmony Oaks HOA was held accountable for its past transgressions and that measures were put in place to prevent future abuses. The FBI launched its own investigation into the Harmony Oaks HOA, uncovering a network of financial irregularities and fraudulent activities. It turned out that Mary Hartdale had been skimming money from the HOA coffers for years, using the funds to finance her lavish lifestyle and to support her campaign of harassment and intimidation. The local news media picked up the story, exposing the HOA's racist practices and highlighting John Cooper's courage in standing up to them. The story sparked a wider conversation about racial bias and the abuse of power within homeowners associations. Mary Hartdale and her accomplices were eventually convicted on multiple charges, including harassment, attempted unlawful detention, impersonating a police officer, and fraud. They were sentenced to significant prison terms, bringing closure to the victims of their reign of terror. The Harmony Oaks community, once fractured by prejudice and fear, began to heal. Black and white homeowners came together to rebuild trust and to create a more inclusive and welcoming neighborhood. John Cooper, now recognized as a local hero, played a key role in this process, organizing community events and fostering dialogue. He even joined the reformed HOA, ensuring that it remained transparent and accountable. The case of the Harmony Oaks HOA served as a cautionary tale, reminding communities across the country of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of vigilance against prejudice and discrimination. It also demonstrated the power of individuals to stand up for what is right, even in the face of overwhelming odds. John Cooper's experience became a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit and the unwavering pursuit of justice. The neighborhood slowly transformed to a community where people were more friendly and understanding. They started to hold meetings together to bring the gap closer between them. No race was targeted anymore, everyone was the same again.